They built a cathedral of sound on a foundation of silence. Their harmony wasn't music. It was the most beautiful lie in the history of rock and roll, a sonic illusion of brotherhood, meticulously crafted by two men locked in a quiet, bitter, lifelong war. A war fought not with fists, but with deadly silences. They sold the world perfect harmony. The price was their own peace. What happens when the most beautiful sound is born from the ugliest silence? This is the story of that beautiful and brutal lie and the brothers who lived it, the Everly brothers. To understand the harmony, you must first understand the hardship. To understand the light, you must first know the dark. The story of the Everly brothers begins not in a glittering metropolis of opportunity, but in the deep, unyielding country, forged in the crucible of America's greatest economic catastrophe. It begins in a place and time where survival was a daily struggle, and music was not a luxury, but a lifeline. The soil of their story is Brownie, Kentucky, a coal mining town in Muhlenberg County, a place so small it was more a whisper on the map than a destination. It was a landscape scarred by the mines, where the air carried the taste of coal dust, and a man's worth was measured by the strength of his back. It was here, on February 1st, 1937, in the heart of the Great Depression, that Isaac Donald Everly was born into a world of profound uncertainty. 2 years later, on January 19, 1939, his brother Philip would arrive. By then, the family had moved to the sprawling industrial city of Chicago, a desperate search for work that pulled them from the familiar hills of Kentucky. But no matter where they went, the family's heart and their sound would forever be rooted in the soil of the rural Midwest, in the mournful melodies and resilient spirit of their heritage. They were the sons of Isaac Ike Everly and Margaret Embry. To say Ike was a musician is to understate his essence. Music was the very fiber of his being. Born in 1908 into a Kentucky family of farmers, Ike was a man of immense, if largely unheralded, talent. He was a pioneer of the thumb-picking style of guitar playing, a complex, syncopated technique he learned directly from black musicians in the coal camps, including the legendary Arnold Schultz, a figure who also profoundly influenced Bill Monroe, the father of bluegrass. Ike's guitar didn't just play melodies, it told stories. It was a self-contained orchestra of bass lines, rhythms, and intricate leads. He possessed a warm, easygoing singing voice that could soothe a troubled soul. But in the years of the Great Depression, professional musician was not a title that guaranteed a steady living. It was a synonym for poverty, a life of constant motion, of chasing any gig in any dusty hall or on any crackling radio broadcast that would put food on the table. Margaret was the family's anchor, the quiet strength that held them together through the storms of poverty and displacement. A woman of deep faith and unwavering resolve, she sang gospel hymns in the local Methodist church, her voice providing the spiritual and emotional bedrock of the family. She was the one who ensured there was order amidst the chaos, love amidst the lack. She was, in essence, the first harmony in the Everly family story. Their childhood was a nomadic one, a map of economic desperation drawn across the American heartland. They were a family unit bound together not just by blood, but by music and motion. Before finally finding a semblance of stability in Shenandoah, Iowa, in 1945, their early years were a blur of rented houses and fleeting communities, a constant cycle of packing and unpacking, of hellos and goodbyes. The instability left a deep and lasting mark, especially on the elder brother, Don. In 1942, during the height of the war, the family lost their home, a trauma of displacement that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would later recall with vivid, painful clarity the image of his father, a man of incredible artistic skill, a virtuoso of the guitar, forced to put down his instrument and take up a pickaxe, laboring in the darkness of the coal mines to support his family. He saw his father's musician's hands, hands meant for crafting beauty, become calloused and blackened with coal dust. This single image, his father's gifted hands blackened with coal dust, ignited a deep-seated fear of poverty in Don. It became more than a fear. It was an obsession, a relentless drive for security that would define the rest of his life and fuel both his boundless ambition and his most destructive demons. In this world of profound hardship, where material comforts were non-existent, survival depended on intangible things. The Everly household had two sources of magic, two lifelines that made the poverty bearable. The first was the music that was made within its walls. Ike was more than a father. He was a mentor, a guru. From the time the boys could talk, music was their second language. There were no formal lessons in the traditional sense. Music was simply the air they breathed. Ike's guitar was a constant presence, its notes filling the small rooms of their rented houses, a soundtrack of comfort and hope. It was Margaret, however, who was their first harmony teacher. As early as 1941, when Dawn was just 4 and Phil a toddler of 2, she would have them singing. She would take the lead on gospel standards like Amazing Grace or In the Garden, and encourage the boys to find the notes that floated above and below her melody. It wasn't a chore. It was a game, as natural as learning to speak. Their voices, still high and pure, learned to intertwine, to find that sacred space where two sounds become one. This was the foundation, the instinctive, intuitive understanding of harmony that would later baffle the world with its seeming effortlessness. The second source of magic crackled out of a large wooden box in the living room. The radio. In an era before television, the radio was the family hearth, the town square, and the window to the world. In the quiet of the evening after a long day of struggle, a station like WHAS out of Louisville or WSM out of Nashville could transport you. It was a portal. Through the static, they heard the mournful yodel of Jimmy Rogers, the blue yodeler, whose songs spoke of rambling men and broken hearts. They heard the powerful, sincere voice of Roy Acuff, the king of country music, singing tales of tragedy and salvation. They heard the intricate guitar work of Merle Travis, a contemporary and friend of their father's, whose playing felt like a conversation with the strings. The radio wasn't just entertainment, it was education. It was a living library of American storytelling and musical tradition. But most importantly, they heard the sound of their own father. By 1945, after years of drifting, Ike had landed the family's first truly stable job as a performer on KMA radio in Shenandoah, Iowa. This was their promised land, a weekly income of around $100. A respectable sum for the time meant they could finally put down roots. For Ike, it was a steady gig, a chance to play his music for a loyal audience. For his sons, it was an apprenticeship of the highest order. The radio was no longer just a box in the living room. It was the family business. The childhood of Dawn and Phil Everly was a childhood lived on the airwaves. In 1946, when Dawn was 9 and Phil was 7, they were officially brought into the family business. Billed as Little Donnie and Baby Boy Phil, they joined their parents on the KMA radio show. The image is almost surreal. Two small boys, dressed in matching Western shirts, standing on apple boxes to reach the microphone, a part of a professional musical act before they had even reached puberty. Every week, sometimes every morning before school, they would stand before a live microphone in front of a live studio audience and sing. They sang the songs of their heritage, sentimental ballads like Kentucky, tales of heartache like Rockin' Alone, and spirited gospel numbers. Their small, high voices, yet to be shaped by adolescence, would weave around their father's warm baritone and their mother's steady alto, creating a four-part harmony that was the talk of southwestern Iowa. It is impossible to overstate the impact of this early intensive experience. While other children were playing in schoolyards, memorizing multiplication tables, the Everly brothers were learning about microphone technique, about phrasing, about how to control their breath and project their voices. They were learning about timing, about how to feel the rhythm in their bones. Most critically, they were learning how to listen. They were learning to listen not just to the notes, but to the spaces between the notes, to the subtle shifts in each other's voices, blending their tones until they became a single shimmering entity. They were learning how to perform, how to build a rapport with an unseen audience of thousands, how to convey emotion through a microphone. The radio studio was their schoolhouse, and the pressure of a live weekly broadcast was their final exam, an exam they had to pass every single week. This relentless professional training is the secret to their magic. Their harmony was not a gift of genetics, it was a feat of engineering. Their voices were two perfectly calibrated instruments, their phrasing machined to a tolerance of microns, all before they were old enough to truly understand the heartbreak they were so perfectly selling. But this professional childhood came at a profound personal cost. The constant moving that had defined their early years, from Kentucky to Chicago to Iowa, and later to Indiana and Tennessee, meant a life of perpetual newness, of friendships left behind before they could truly blossom, of never quite fitting in. They were always the new kids, the outsiders. This sense of dislocation was felt most acutely by Don. In interviews given decades later, when the wall of his fame had finally begun to crack, he would confide a secret he had carried for a lifetime, a wound that never fully healed. When the family moved from the rural South, his hillbilly accent, a badge of his Kentucky roots, became a source of intense ridicule among his new classmates, particularly in the more urban environments of the North. He was relentlessly bullied for sounding backwards, for being a hick. This experience, common for many Appalachian migrants of the era, instilled in him a deep-seated insecurity, a painful feeling of being an outsider that would linger long after he became one of the most famous people in the world. It was the beginning of a dangerous pattern, the construction of a hidden inner life. To survive the schoolyard, he learned to build a fortress around his true self. He developed a public persona of cool confidence, a quiet, almost aloof exterior that masked a roiling private world of anxiety and self-doubt. This was the first of many secrets, the first layer of the beautiful lie. He learned that to be accepted, he had to perform, not just on stage, but in life. The harmony with his brother became a sanctuary, the one place where he felt perfectly understood, where his voice fit without question or judgment. But outside of that harmony, he was increasingly alone, a stranger in a strange land, even when that land was just a classroom in his new hometown. The boy who would one day sing to millions about the pain of loneliness was learning his subject firsthand. The life of an itinerant radio family, even a successful one, was a precarious one. By the early 1950s, the golden age of live radio was beginning to fade as the flickering blue light of television began to capture the nation's imagination. The show in Iowa ended, and the search for work began again. The family moved to Evansville, Indiana, then to Knoxville, Tennessee, a major hub for country music, hoping Ike could find a spot on the powerful WROL station. When that failed to provide long-term security, they eventually landed back in Chicago, where Ike performed on the famous WLS National Barn Dance. For the teenage Don and Phil, this period was a frustrating but formative one. They were no longer the cute child act, little Donnie and baby boy Phil. They were now a burgeoning duo in their own right, their voices deepening, their harmonies tightening into the signature, close harmony sound that would soon captivate the world. They were writing their own songs, developing their own style, a unique blend of their father's country picking, the mournful ballads of the Appalachians, and the new electrifying sounds of rhythm and blues they were hearing on the radio. They were a hybrid, a new thing, and the world didn't yet have a category for them. Their father, Ike, a man with no illusions about the harsh realities of the music business, recognized a fundamental shift. He saw that his son's talent, their youthful energy, and their unique sound were rapidly eclipsing his own. With a mixture of pride and paternal pragmatism, he made a decision that would change their lives forever. He knew that their future, if they were to have one, lay not in the fading world of radio barn dances, but in the undisputed cutthroat capital of country music, Nashville, Tennessee. Ike was friends with some of the most influential guitarists in the business, men like his old Kentucky compatriot Merle Travis and the brilliant burgeoning genius Chet Atkins. In 1953, using these precious connections, Ike made a fateful call to Atkins, who was by then not just a star guitarist, but a powerful A&R man and producer at RCA Records in Nashville. Chet Atkins was the gatekeeper. He was one of the key architects of the burgeoning Nashville sound, a more polished, pop-inflected style of country music designed to cross over to a wider audience. He was a man with an impeccable ear for a hit and an uncanny eye for talent. He agreed to meet the boys. The move to Nashville was a monumental leap of faith. The family packed up once again, pouring all their hopes and meager savings into this one last shot. They settled into the vibrant, competitive world of Music Row, a neighborhood teeming with thousands of hopeful singers, songwriters, and musicians, all chasing the same elusive dream. To make ends meet while his sons auditioned and networked, Ike Everly, the guitar virtuoso, swallowed his pride and found work as a barber, his own musical ambitions now fully secondary to those of his sons. Chet Atkins was impressed, deeply impressed. He heard something in their voices that was both ancient and modern. He recognized the unique, almost telepathic quality of their harmonies, a seamless blend that could only come from a lifetime of singing together. He took them under his wing, becoming a mentor and a champion. He got them a spot performing on the Grand Ole Opry, the ultimate stage for any aspiring country act. But getting a record deal was another matter entirely. In the summer of 1953, Don and Phil cut their first demo, a song written by Don called Keep A-Lovin' Me. It was a solid, upbeat country number showcasing their tight harmonies and rhythmic drive, but it failed to generate any real interest. The problem was that the Everly Brothers didn't quite fit. In the rigid, conservative world of 1950s Nashville, you were either country or you were pop. The brothers existed in a strange, beautiful, and commercially unproven space in between. They weren't traditional enough for the hardcore country labels, and they weren't yet rock and roll enough for the new, independent labels that were starting to pop up in places like Memphis and Chicago. This was a period of immense pressure and growing frustration. The dream seemed so close, yet agonizingly out of reach. Ike, watching his son struggle and feeling the weight of his own stalled career, began to drink more heavily, a quiet sadness settling over the man who had sacrificed so much. The family's financial situation was precarious. The brothers, now young men on the cusp of adulthood, were beginning to feel the first stirrings of a lifelong rivalry. Don, as the older brother and the primary songwriter, was the natural leader, a role that the quietly ambitious and equally talented Phil sometimes chafed against. The pressures of Nashville were beginning to expose the first hairline cracks in their perfect harmony. And, in the hothouse atmosphere of Nashville's burgeoning music scene, new temptations were emerging. The pressure to perform, to network, to stay awake for late-night jam sessions and long drives to out-of-town gigs led many musicians to rely on stimulants. Don, still just a teenager, but already carrying the weight of his family's hopes on his shoulders, was introduced to the world of pep pills and other drugs. According to later interviews and biographies, Don first tried powerful stimulants around 1955 at the age of 18. It was the beginning of a secret, decades-long battle with addiction, a habit he concealed from his family and the public. It was another layer of the hidden life he was constructing, a dangerous coping mechanism for the anxieties that had plagued him since childhood, now magnified by the relentless pressure to succeed. By 1956, their careers seemed to have stalled completely. They were playing small gigs, writing songs, and waiting for a break that felt like it might never come. Their one single, a re-recorded version of Keep a Lovin' Me for Columbia Records, had flopped disastrously, selling only a few hundred copies. They were on the verge of giving up, of becoming another Nashville cautionary tale. It was then that Chet Atkins, still believing in their unique potential, made one last desperate call to a man named Archie Bleyer, a pop music mogul in New York, who knew next to nothing about two country boys from Kentucky. It was their last hope. The seeds planted in the hard Kentucky soil were about to either blossom spectacularly or wither on the vine forever. And the answer would come not from the familiar hills of Tennessee, but from another world entirely, the glass and steel skyscrapers of New York City. Archie Bleyer was not a man of rock and roll. He was a product of a different era, a classically trained musician and former band leader who had served as the musical director for Arthur Godfrey, one of the biggest stars of early radio and television. His company, Cadence Records, based in New York, was a small independent label specializing in polished, easy-listening pop, with artists like Andy Williams and the Chordettes. He was a savvy, sophisticated music man, but he knew very little about the raw, earthy world of Nashville country. When Chet Atkins called, pitching the Everly Brothers, Bleyer was skeptical. He didn't see the commercial potential in their unclassifiable hybrid music. However, Bleyer's respect for Chet Atkins was immense. Based almost entirely on Atkins's recommendation, Bleyer agreed to sign the brothers. It was a modest deal, almost a trial run, a one-year contract for a salary of $1,000. For Don and Phil, it was everything. It was their last shot, a fragile chance to prove that their unique sound had a place in the world. The pressure was unimaginable. The entire family had sacrificed everything for this moment. Their father's career had been put on hold. They had moved countless times. Failure was not an option. The turning point, the moment that would alter the course of popular music, came not from a flash of inspiration in the studio, but from a moment of shared desperation. At the Acuff Rose publishing offices in Nashville, a talented husband and wife songwriting team, Boudleaux and Felice Bryant, were at the end of their rope. They had written a song. It was a catchy, up-tempo number with a slightly melancholic edge, a story of a man so heartbroken he wishes he were dead, but told with an infectious, almost joyous rhythm. The song was called Bye Bye Love. The Bryants were respected songwriters, but this song was a tough sell. It had been rejected by an astonishing 30 different artists and labels. It was considered too pop for the country artists and too country for the pop artists. Even Elvis Presley, who could have easily blurred those lines, had turned it down. It was a song without a home. It existed in the same hybrid, undefined space that the Everly Brothers occupied. It was, in other words, the perfect song for them. When Don and Phil heard the demo, they knew it instantly. The melody, the lyrics, the sentiment, it all resonated with their own experience. Archie Blair, the pop man from New York, hated it. He thought the opening, with its driving, almost percussive acoustic guitar riff, was messy and uncommercial. He didn't understand its hybrid nature, but this time, Don and Phil fought back. Fueled by desperation and an absolute belief in their instincts, they championed the song. They recorded a demo in RCA's Nashville studio, with Chet Atkins playing a tasteful lead guitar. But it was Don's powerful rhythmic acoustic guitar riff that became the soul of the record. It was a revolutionary sound, using the acoustic guitar not just as a melodic instrument, but as a percussion section, creating an irresistible momentum. And over that rhythmic bed, their voices locked in a tight kinetic harmony, a sound that was at once heartbroken and exhilarating. Released in March of 1957, Bye Bye Love was a lightning bolt. It was the right song, by the right artist at the perfect moment. It was a sound that no one had ever heard before, yet it felt instantly familiar. It was the sound of a country heart learning to beat at the speed of rock and roll, a new language that could speak the mournful grammar of the mountains with the urgent electric slang of the city. Country stations played it, pop stations played it, and most remarkably R&B stations, which catered primarily to a black audience, played it. The record was an absolute smash. It shot to number 1 on the country charts, number 2 on the pop charts, and even crossed over to the R&B charts. It sold over 1 million copies, earning them their first gold record. Overnight, the Everly Brothers were no longer struggling artists. They were a phenomenon. Just a few months later, they made their national debut on The Ed Sullivan Show, performing for a television audience of tens of millions. They were the perfect image for the era. They were handsome, they were polite, they were non-threatening, unlike Elvis or Jerry Lee Lewis. But their music had an undeniable restless energy. They were the perfect package, safe enough for the parents, but exciting enough for the teenagers. And it was just the beginning. The floodgates had opened. In September, they released Wake Up Little Susie, a controversial but irresistible story of 2 teenagers who fall asleep at the drive-in and have to face the wrath of their parents and the gossip of the town. The lyrics, with their implication of teenage intimacy, caused a minor uproar. It was banned in Boston and a few other cities for being suggestive, but the controversy only fueled its appeal. It shot to number 1 on the pop charts, cementing their status as the biggest stars in the country. The hits came with a speed and consistency that was breathtaking. All I Have to Do Is Dream, a beautiful ethereal ballad, again penned by Boudleaux Bryant, that showcased the sheer unmatched beauty of their harmony. It was like a musical sigh, becoming a worldwide number 1 hit. Then came Bird Dog, a clever novelty rocker, which was contrasted by its B-side, Devoted to You, another timeless ballad. Between 1957 and 1958, they were arguably the biggest musical act in the world, rivaled only by Elvis Presley. They landed 4 number 1 Billboard hits in just 16 months. They were the undisputed kings of harmony. But the whirlwind of fame was a dangerous and disorienting storm. The pressure was immense. They were constantly on the road, part of the grueling package tours of the era, traveling by bus from city to city, performing night after night alongside stars like Buddy Holly, the Drifters, and Fats Domino. For Don, the anxieties that had been planted in his childhood, the insecurities, the fear of failure, the fear of poverty, were now magnified 1,000 times over. The drugs that had been a secret, occasional indulgence in Nashville now became a necessary tool for survival. They were a way to manage the crushing pressure of being a teen idol, a way to have the energy to perform night after night, and a way to numb the internal demons that were screaming in his head. This was the dark secret behind the bright smiles and the perfect harmonies. The higher they soared, the more the cracks in their private lives began to deepen. The success also created new tensions with their label. They were generating millions of dollars for Cadence Records, but they felt their own financial compensation and creative control were not commensurate with their status. The relationship with Archie Bleyer, who had initially been skeptical of their sound, became increasingly strained. They were his biggest stars, but they were also the outsiders, the country boys he never truly understood. And it was during this period of intense fame and hidden turmoil that another secret layer of Don's life allegedly took shape. Biographies and later articles, citing sources close to the brothers, would speak of a persistent, if unconfirmed, rumor that has become part of Don's legend, a secret bisexual life that stood in stark contrast to his public image as a teenage heartthrob. In the deeply conservative, homophobic world of the 1950s, such a revelation would have been catastrophic, an absolute career ender. It was a secret, if true, that had to be guarded at all costs, another heavy stone added to the wall of his hidden inner world. They had conquered America. Now it was time to conquer the world and to secure a financial future that would banish the ghosts of his father's struggles forever. By 1959, the Everly Brothers were one of the most valuable commodities in the music industry. Their contract with Cadence was coming to an end, and a bidding war ensued among the major labels. They were managed by the powerful Wesley Rose, one of the architects of the Nashville music publishing empire, and also the manager of the Bryant family. Rose negotiated a deal that was, at the time, completely unprecedented. In late 1959, Don and Phil Everly signed a 10-year, $1 million contract with the newly formed Warner Brothers Records. It was the biggest recording contract in history. $1 million in 1959 is the equivalent of nearly $10 million today. For Don, the boy who had watched his father labor for pennies, it was the ultimate symbol of security. It was a validation that he would never, ever have to experience the instability that had defined his childhood. Their debut on their new label had to be a statement, and it was. Kathy's Clown, a song written by Don, with an uncredited assist from Phil, was their masterpiece. It was not a simple pop song. It was a mini opera, a complex, emotionally devastating song of romantic betrayal, but its true genius lay in its revolutionary structure and sound. It was built on a series of dramatic stop-start rhythms and a haunting, almost hypnotic harmony structure based on a classical piece, Fer de Groffet's Grand Canyon Suite, that Don had heard on the radio. Their voices didn't blend in the conventional way. They dueled, one voice soaring in anguish, while the other responded with a steady, almost mocking refrain. Kathy's Clown was a global sensation. It sat at number 1 on the U.S. pop charts for 5 weeks and became their first number 1 hit in the United Kingdom. It sold over 2 million copies, becoming their biggest selling single. It was a work of pure, unadulterated genius, and its influence was immediate and profound. Across the Atlantic, in the gritty port city of Liverpool, a group of young, ambitious musicians were listening intently. John Lennon and Paul McCartney, of the still unknown Beatles, were obsessed with the Everly Brothers. They studied their harmonies, dissecting how the two voices would weave together, how one would hold a note while the other moved around it. Kathy's Clown, with its unique harmony structure, was a particular revelation. The Beatles' own early sound, particularly the close harmonies on songs like Please Please Me and Love Me Do, is a direct echo of the sound that Don and Phil Everly had perfected. Paul McCartney would later state flatly, "We were a two-part harmony group. They were a two-part harmony group. We were them." The Everly Brothers were now international superstars, touring the world, their music a global language. The hits continued to flow on Warner Brothers. The beautifully melancholic When Will I Be Loved, later made into an even bigger hit by Linda Ronstadt, the epic ballad Let It Be Me, the rockabilly-infused Walk Right Back, and the sublime Crying in the Rain, co-written by a young Carole King. They were on top of the world creatively and commercially. But the same forces that had lifted them to such dizzying heights were beginning to conspire against them. The $1 million contract came with $1 million expectations. The pressure to continue producing chart-topping hits was relentless. For Don, the contract, rather than bringing peace, created a new kind of anxiety, the fear of losing it all. His addiction, fueled by the stress and the endless availability of drugs on tour, was beginning to spiral out of control. His private life was unraveling. His first marriage was falling apart. He was becoming increasingly erratic and distant. In November of 1961, at the absolute peak of their global fame, their momentum was stopped dead. In a move that shocked their fans and the music industry, both Don and Phil joined the United States Marine Corps Reserve. While their 6-month stint of active duty was largely a public relations exercise, it pulled them off the road and out of the studio at a critical moment. The relentless rhythm of hit-making was broken. It was a pause, a breath in the hurricane. But when they returned, they would find that the world of music and their own world had begun to change in ways they could never have anticipated. The imperial phase was ending, and a long, painful decline was about to begin. For in every classic tragedy, the pinnacle of glory is also where the shadow of the fall begins to stretch the longest. For the Everly Brothers, that fateful turn would come not in the form of a musical rival, but of a draft notice and the demons they had long tried to keep hidden. The decision for Don and Phil to enlist in the United States Marine Corps Reserves was a calculated one, a public relations move designed to preempt the draft and present a patriotic image during the escalating tensions of the Cold War. But its consequences were far from calculated. The 6-month stint of active duty, primarily served at Camp Pendleton in California, pulled them off the road and out of the studio at the most critical moment imaginable. The relentless rhythm of writing, recording, and touring, the very engine of their success, was abruptly switched off. When they returned to civilian life in mid-1962, the world they had left behind was already beginning to change. Crying in the Rain would be their last top 10 hit in the United States. It was as if the pause, however brief, had broken the spell. The musical landscape was shifting beneath their feet. The polished heartache of their sound, once revolutionary, was beginning to sound familiar. And across the Atlantic, a storm was gathering, a storm they themselves had helped to create. The British invasion, the very movement they had so profoundly influenced, was about to explode onto the American scene. Bands like the Beatles, the Hollies, and the Searchers, all of whom had built their early sound on the foundation of the Everly's harmonies, were now creating a new, louder, and more energetic sound that would soon make the Everly Brothers seem like a relic of a bygone era. The students had surpassed the masters, and the masters were about to be left behind. But the most significant damage was happening not on the charts, but behind the scenes. The pressures of fame, the exhaustion of constant touring, and the complex internal family dynamics were now compounded by Don's escalating addiction. What had begun as a coping mechanism in Nashville had morphed into a full-blown dependency. The $1 million contract, meant to provide security, had instead become a golden cage, intensifying the pressure to maintain an impossible level of success. The stimulants once used to stay awake on long bus rides were now a daily necessity, supplemented by a cocktail of other drugs. The hidden inner world he had constructed since childhood had become a prison, and the walls were beginning to crumble. The breaking point came in 1962. During a grueling tour in London, the city that had once crowned them kings, Don collapsed backstage at the Prince of Wales Theatre. It was a complete physical and nervous breakdown, fueled by a drug overdose. The official story meticulously crafted for the press was food poisoning and nervous exhaustion. Phil, ever the protector of the family image, was forced to play along, telling reporters his brother was simply overworked. The collapse in London was not just a breakdown, it was a tearing of the veil. For the first time, the beautiful lie of the perfect harmony was exposed, revealing the brutal private war that had been raging behind the sound all along. The reality was far darker. Don was secretly flown back to the United States and hospitalized. He underwent electroconvulsive therapy, a brutal and controversial treatment at the time. In an attempt to break the cycle of addiction and depression, the incident was a brutal wake-up call, but the addiction had taken deep root. The years that followed were a slow, painful decline, a study in artistic frustration and personal disintegration. The music, once a source of joy and telepathic connection, now became a source of conflict. The recording studio, once their sanctuary, became a battleground. Don's addiction made him erratic, unreliable, and paranoid. Phil, who did not share his brother's demons, was forced into the role of the responsible one, the caretaker, a position that bred a deep and lasting resentment. He had to ensure they made it to gigs, had to cover for Don's forgotten lyrics and missed cues, and had to maintain the illusion of professionalism while his brother was falling apart. Their legendary harmony, so effortless on record, was now an act of sheer willpower on stage. The public could hear that something was missing. The spark was gone. The albums they released in the mid to late 60s, records like Beat and Soul, and the pioneering country rock album Roots, were often critically acclaimed and artistically ambitious. Roots, in particular, was a stunning return to their musical heritage, featuring recordings of their parents and early radio broadcasts. It was a deeply personal and influential album, a precursor to the country rock movement that would sweep California a few years later. But the public wasn't listening. These albums failed to sell, lost in a sea of psychedelic rock and Motown soul. They were adrift in a musical world they had helped to create, but no longer belonged to. By the early 1970s, the act had become a grim parody of its former glory. They were relegated to playing the nostalgia circuit, casinos in Las Vegas, state fairs, and theme parks. The brotherly love that had defined their image was now a distant memory, replaced by a cold, professional distance. They would often travel separately, arrive at the venue just before the show, perform their set with practiced but hollow perfection, and leave without speaking a word to each other. The harmony was the only thing that remained. A beautiful, heartbreaking lie performed night after night. The final spectacular implosion, the moment the private war became irrevocably public, came on July 14th, 1973. They were booked for a concert at Knott's Berry Farm in Buena Park, California. Don, drunk and high on champagne and tequila, was struggling to get through the show. He was forgetting lyrics, flubbing chords. his timing completely off. The tension on stage was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket of anger and frustration. After a disastrous rendition of Kathy's Clown, their magnum opus, Phil reached his breaking point. He could no longer be the caretaker, no longer prop up the facade. In a fit of pure, unadulterated rage and a decade's worth of pent-up frustration, he lifted his acoustic guitar, smashed it to pieces on the stage, and walked off, leaving his brother alone in the spotlight. Don, dazed and disoriented, tried to continue the show alone for a few moments, the band uncertainly playing behind him. He then turned to the stunned and confused crowd. His words were slurred, but their meaning was brutally clear. The Everly Brothers, he announced into the microphone, died 10 years ago. The perfect harmony was officially and violently silenced. They would not speak to each other, let alone sing together, for over a decade. The beautiful lie had finally shattered. But what comes after the deafening crack of a smashed guitar and the dissolution of a brotherhood? Not a fiery battle, but a long, cold silence. A decade of being lost, where two halves of a perfect whole would have to learn to survive alone in a wilderness of their own making. The decade that followed the explosion at Knott's Berry Farm was a long winter of discontent. The Everly Brothers were dead, and in their place were two men adrift, haunted by the ghost of a perfect harmony. They were two halves of a perfect whole, now separated and struggling to find their own voices in a world that only wanted to hear them sing together. The public had fallen in love with a singular entity. A sound and a single Everly brother felt like an incomplete equation, a chord missing its crucial note. For Don, the silence was initially a deafening roar of liberation, freedom from the pressure, freedom from the road, and most of all, freedom from Phil. But that freedom came at a staggering cost. He released a few solo albums like Don Everly and Sunset Towers, which were respectable but commercially invisible. The musical world had moved on, and Don Everly, the solo artist, was a footnote in a story he had helped to write. His addiction, which had precipitated the breakup, continued to plague him. Without the structure of the duo, his life spiraled further out of control. The fortune he had amassed, the $1 million contract that was supposed to be his ultimate security, evaporated. In 1976, Don Everly, one of the most successful recording artists of his generation, filed for bankruptcy, claiming assets of just a few $1,000s. He retreated from the music industry epicenters of Los Angeles and Nashville, moving into a trailer park in the Midwest, a broken man living in the shadow of his own legend. For Phil, the split was also initially a release. He was no longer the caretaker, no longer responsible for his brother's volatile behavior. He pursued his own solo career with more determination than Don. He released several albums like Star Spangled Springer and Phil's Diner, which received modest critical praise. He even scored a minor hit in the United Kingdom with the song She Means Nothing to Me, a duet with the British rock star Cliff Richard. He was a constant presence on the English club circuit, where the love for the Everly Brothers' legacy had never faded. But he, too, discovered a harsh truth. The magic was in the blend. His voice, pure and beautiful on its own, felt incomplete without his brother's lower harmony to anchor it. The resentment he had harbored for years was now mixed with the frustrating realization that his own identity was inextricably and perhaps permanently linked to the man he no longer spoke to. They had been a binary star system, two suns gravitationally bound to each other, but whose very proximity had created a force too volatile to contain. Now they were two dying stars flung into the cold, empty void, forever feeling the ghost of the other's gravitational pull. They lived separate lives in separate worlds. Don struggled with his demons in quiet obscurity. Phil toured relentlessly, trying to build a career on his own terms. The silence between them was absolute, a chasm of anger, hurt, and misunderstanding. To the world it seemed the harmony was gone forever, a beautiful memory from a more innocent time. Then, as the 10th anniversary of their breakup approached, something began to shift. The long winter began to thaw. The catalyst was not a single event, but a confluence of factors. Time had begun to soften the sharp edges of their anger. A lucrative financial offer was on the table, a powerful motivator for two men who had struggled financially for a decade. But the most powerful impetus came from their father. Ike Everly, the man who had taught them their first chords, was in failing health. His deepest wish was to see his sons make music together again before he died. The weight of that paternal hope, combined with the passage of time, was enough to bring them cautiously back to the table. They agreed to a reunion, but it couldn't be just any show. It had to be an event. The location chosen was the prestigious Royal Albert Hall in London, a venue loaded with symbolic weight. London was the city that had embraced them as superstars, but it was also the city where Don had collapsed 2 decades earlier, the beginning of their long unraveling. A return to this stage was not just a reunion, it was a chance at redemption. The demand for tickets was immediate and overwhelming. 2 nights were scheduled for September 22nd and 23rd, 1983. They sold out instantly. The world, it seemed, had been waiting. The days leading up to the concert were fraught with tension. The brothers rehearsed together, speaking only when necessary, communicating primarily through the music. No one knew what to expect. Would the old resentments flare up? Would the magic still be there after 10 years of bitter silence? Would they even make it through the show? The night of the first show, the atmosphere in the Royal Albert Hall was electric. It felt less like a rock concert and more like a historic summit. Then the lights dimmed. The crowd roared. From opposite sides of the stage, 2 figures emerged from the darkness. Don and Phil, now graying and in their mid-40s, walked slowly towards the center, their steps measured and deliberate. They met at the microphones, shook hands formally, almost awkwardly, and picked up their acoustic guitars. They didn't smile. They didn't speak to the audience. They simply looked at each other, a quick, unreadable glance that carried the weight of a lifetime. Don struck the opening chords of The Price of Love, a driving bluesy number. The sound of his acoustic guitar, that signature percussive rhythm, filled the hall. And then they sang. The moment their voices touched, a third voice was born in the space between them, the ghost of the Everly brothers, resurrected from a decade of silence, more perfect and heartbreakingly beautiful than anyone had remembered. It was as if no time had passed at all. For the next 2 hours, they played the soundtrack of a generation, Bye Bye Love, Kathy's Clown, All I Have to Do Is Dream, Wake Up Little Susie. The concert was more than just a musical event. It was a moment of profound cathartic release for both the brothers and their fans. On stage, the 2 men seemed to rediscover the telepathic connection that had defined their youth. They watched each other's every move, their voices weaving together with an intuitive grace that bordered on the supernatural. Between songs, the tension was still visible. Their banter was minimal and strained, but when the music started, the discord vanished, replaced by the perfect, beautiful lie of their harmony. The concert was a massive, unqualified success, spawning a hit live album and a renewed interest in their career. The reunion ushered in a new era. They recorded a new studio album, EB-84, which featured the beautiful song On the Wings of a Nightingale, written for them as a tribute by their most famous disciple, Paul McCartney. Suddenly, the Everly Brothers were relevant again. They were inducted into the inaugural class of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986, alongside Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard. They were honored with a Lifetime Achievement Grammy in 1997 and inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2001. They toured successfully for another 2 decades, elder statesmen now, their legacy finally secure. But the deep-seated issues that had driven them apart had never truly been resolved. They had found a way to work together, but they had not found a way to be brothers again. The harmony was back on stage, but the discord remained off of it. Phil would later admit in an interview, in a quote that perfectly encapsulated their entire relationship, "Don and I are two very different people. The only time we really get along is when we're singing." The reunion had saved their careers, but it could not fully heal their relationship. The final act of their story would be one of quiet acceptance, of a peace made with the music, if not with each other. The harmony had been restored to the stage, but the men who made it were forever changed. They now entered the final chapter of their lives, not as reconciled brothers, but as survivors, carrying their shared legacy to its very end. The reunion at the Royal Albert Hall was not a magical cure for a lifetime of discord. It was instead a truce, a pragmatic and necessary peace treaty brokered by time, financial necessity, and a shared understanding that their legacy was too important to be left in shattered pieces on a California stage. For the next 2 decades, they toured the world as the Everly Brothers, elder statesmen of rock and roll, their place in the pantheon now secure and undisputed. Their live shows became master classes in professionalism. The harmonies were flawless, the guitar playing impeccable, the hits delivered with a practiced grace that satisfied the legions of fans who came to hear the soundtrack of their youth. But the warmth, the easy camaraderie of their early days was gone, replaced by a polite and palpable distance. They were no longer brothers sharing a microphone. They were 2 highly skilled professionals executing a beloved piece of art. They were a business partnership again, and this time, both men understood the terms. The accolades they had been denied during their years in the wilderness now rained down upon them. Their induction into the inaugural class of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986 was a profound validation, placing them rightfully alongside their peers and inspirations like Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard. The Lifetime Achievement Grammy in 1997 and their induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2001 solidified their status as foundational pillars of not one, but 2 major genres of American music. Off stage, they maintained their separate lives. They traveled on separate buses, stayed in separate hotel rooms, and rarely socialized. The long simmering resentments and fundamental differences in their personalities had not vanished. Don remained the introspective, sometimes volatile, artistic soul. Phil was the steady, pragmatic, and more business-minded of the 2. They had simply learned, after decades of conflict, how to contain the discord within the confines of their private lives, protecting the sanctity of the harmony for the public. They had accepted the profound irony of their existence. The only time they could truly find peace with each other was for the 2 hours a night they spent on stage, singing songs about love and heartbreak, their voices locked in a perfect, intimate embrace. The performance of unity had become their final, lasting form of connection. The long goodbye began on January 3, 2014. Phil Everly, the younger brother with the soaring high harmony, passed away from complications of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease at the age of 74. His death was attributed to a lifetime of smoking, a habit that had defined the restless, anxious energy of their era. The news sent a shockwave through the music world. Don's reaction to his brother's death was a rare and shattering glimpse behind the curtain of their guarded relationship. He released a statement to the Associated Press, and his words were not those of a detached business partner, but of a heartbroken brother. "I'm not over it," he confessed. "I really feel sad. I think about him every day." He spoke of their final conversation, a simple phone call on New Year's Day, just 2 days before Phil's death. He admitted, with a lifetime of regret in his voice, he was a great singer. "I was the only one who could ever argue with him, and he was the only one who could ever argue with me." It was not a truce. It was a final, unconditional surrender. In the face of his brother's permanent silence, the quiet war Don had waged his entire life, against his own vulnerability, against his own need for his brother, was finally, irrevocably lost. All that was left was the love he had spent a lifetime trying to hide. 7 years later, on August 21st, 2021, Don Everly died in his home in Nashville at the age of 84. The older brother, the driving rhythmic force, the dark, melancholic soul of the duo, was gone. With his passing, the other half of the sound that had defined a generation was silenced. The perfect harmony was now forever a memory. The legacy of the Everly Brothers is a study in beautiful contradictions. They were country boys who became rock and roll pioneers, teen idols with the souls of mature artists, and two men locked in a lifetime of conflict who produced a sound of sublime, unattainable unity. Their harmony was, in the end, their greatest creation and their most profound tragedy. It was a sound so perfect and effortless that it created an impossible ideal, an image of brotherly love that they themselves could never live up to. It was a sound that told a beautiful story, a story the brothers themselves could never truly live. But it was a lie that told a deeper, more universal truth, speaking to our own primal yearning for connection and wholeness. The art they created transcended their personal pain, achieving a kind of perfection that real life rarely allows. This influential perfection became etched into the very DNA of popular music, forging a mold for the Beatles, the Beach Boys, and Simon and Garfunkel. They were the indispensable bridge, the missing link between the raw heartache of country and the rebellious energy of rock and roll. Ultimately, the story of Don and Phil Everly is both a cautionary tale about the price of fame and family and a story of redemption. It is the story of how two warring brothers found a way, through their shared gift, to give the world something pure and transcendent. Their story is the ultimate brutal proof that art does not require truth to be beautiful. Their greatest gift to the world was a perfect lie, the sound of a brotherhood that never truly existed. And in the end, perhaps that is the most profound legacy of all, that from their lifelong war they created a sound of perfect, eternal peace.